Good afternoon. Welcome to Kick Some Ask, 3 Steps to Asking Questions That Matter with Amy Leneker. I'm Jessica Dang with Results Washington. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be your moderator today. We have about 1,600 attendees registered for this session, and we're so happy you're here. I'm joined by Melissa Shaw, who will be providing ASL interpretation today, and thanks to my team member, John, who is behind the scenes managing technology. I want to share a few things before we get started. We know many of you are familiar with Zoom meetings, but there's some difference in Zoom webinar, which we're using today. The biggest difference is you won't be able to talk or have your video visible. This ensures all participants can focus on today's presentation. We want to draw your attention to a few different features in Zoom and how we'll use them. Move your mouse and the toolbar will appear. You can see the icons for chat and Q&A. Chat will be on intermittently throughout today's presentation, and you can post your questions into the Q&A feature, which we will get to towards the end of today's presentation. We know we won't be able to get to every question, but we hope to have time for a few of them today. If you have any technical issues, please use Q&A feature and we'll do our best to help you. Closed captioning is available. You'll notice the icon for closed captioning. If you wish to see it, just select live transcript and select view full transcript, and that will be available to you. You can adjust your screen view by moving this vertical bar from left to right to see either the presentation or the presenter in a bigger screen. Session materials are available on our website, and a video from today's presentation will be posted within about a week. If we get disconnected, we will try to get the presentation going for about 5 minutes. If we're not able to, we will record and post at a different time. Finally, at the end of the session, a survey will pop up. Please take a moment to complete it. It will provide the presenter and Results Washington with some great real-time feedback. Now you guys are all in for a treat. We have Amy Leneker with us today. Amy is an optimistic, joy-seeking, recovering perfectionist. She's also a leadership consultant and Dare to Lead facilitator. Amy was born and raised in the Midwest, where she learned to work hard, tell the truth, and be kind. Although she left Ohio long ago, those Midwestern values are still very much a part of who she is and how she works. With over 2 decades of experience in leadership development in the public sector, Amy found a consulting firm and now works with leaders and teams all over the world. She and her husband have 2 wonderful kiddos and 3 wacky dogs and make their home in the Pacific Northwest. Learn more at thelenekerteam.com. Welcome, Amy.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here. It was so fun to see all of the places that we are joining from today. I saw lots of different states and lots of different comments on the weather. So thank you for being here. As we kick off, I'm curious to know, how much time do you spend talking versus listening? If you say that you spend more time talking than listening, you are like the vast majority of people. Our time today is going to focus on how can we move through our day? How can we move through our organizations with a focus on listening and not just talking? We're going to talk about how do we ask the questions that really matter. A huge thank you to Results Washington for putting on this stellar conference. Thank you, Melissa, for offering the interpretation. I'm so glad that this team was able to come together. I have 2 asks for you today. If you have been in a training of mine before, you'll have seen this slide many times. If this is our first time together, I hope it's our first of many times. The 2 asks that I always have, the first one is that you take care of yourself, whatever that looks like. If you need to stand up, if you need to stretch, if you need to pass on an exercise, whatever it is that you need to do to get out of this what you need, that's what I want for you. And my second ask is that we take care of each other, that we create a really safe, inclusive learning environment where we can explore this topic together. And we can do that through the words we use in the chat. We can do that through the questions we ask. How do we create a safe, inclusive environment where we can all be our best selves? There is a handout for this class. So special thanks to John, who just put it in the chat feature for you. The handout is designed so everything that we cover is in that handout. If you want to take any of these exercises back into your team, and I hope that you do, you've got everything in that handout that you need. You'll also notice on page 4 is a source document. I believe really strongly in giving credit where credit is due. So all of the authors and articles and books and TED Talks, all of those resources that were used to help create this workshop, you can find all of those in the source document. If you want to dive a little deeper into any of the research, they're all hyperlinked. So you're just one click away from diving into that. Here is my first question for you. Why are you here? Not in a philosophical way, as in why are you here in this world, but why are you here in this workshop? There are a million ways you could be spending the next hour of your life. So enter into the chat feature, why are you here? It'll help me to get a sense of what is it you're hoping to get out of this workshop. And John, would you go ahead and open up the chat for us? All right, Jessica was first. Thank you. To learn, love that. To be a better listener. I want to be more curious. Thank you. I want to learn and grow. And look how fast they're coming in. I love this. I want to ask better questions. Thank you for that. I want more tips on how to support my team. Thank you. It went by so quickly. I didn't get to catch your name, but to the individual who said that you want to better support your team, thank you for that. I think it is such a wonderful thing we can do in workshops like this, is that we think about it from our own perspective. What is it that I can achieve? But then also this other perspective. What is it that I can do to help support other people? Thank you for that. I want to formulate questions differently. I want to expand my communication. Stephen says, I always want to get better. Yes, that is such a great way to think about it. I always want to get better. Love that. Whyever it is that you are here, I'm really glad that you are. And if you clicked on the wrong Zoom link and you're not sure why you're here, I'm still glad you're here. I believe that in the next hour, we can learn alongside each other. We can really figure out how we can ask questions in a new way. Since you shared why you were here, I wanted to share why I'm here. I love to learn. I must have seen a few dozen of you in the chat feature that said you're here to learn. That's why I'm here too. That picture that you're looking at, that's me in the 3rd grade. My mom is on this Zoom call and she will not take credit for why my hair looks that way. So Mom, if you want to jump into the chat feature at some point and explain yourself, my hair was wildly crooked, but I'm happy. I'm holding a book, I'm learning. Anytime I'm learning, I feel like I'm the best version of me. And that love of learning has carried through my entire life. I was the first person in my family to go to college, first person to go to graduate school. And I can count on one hand, actually on 3 fingers, the number of times that I've seen my dad cry. And that photo was one of them. It was a really big deal for my family that I had had access to higher education in a way that all the generations before me did not. And I've never taken that for granted. I've never taken for granted what happens when we intentionally build really safe, inclusive environments where we can thrive together. And the 3rd reason I'm here, this is my most important reason, this is my family. So this is my husband and my kiddos. Go Sounders, if there are any soccer fans out there. And here's what we know from research, and here's what we know from our own lives, is that how we are at work impacts how we are at home. And how we are at home can impact how we are at work. And so I believe in how do we create as healthy and as happy work environments as we can, so that at the end of the day, when we go back into our families, back into our communities, that we can be the very best version of ourselves. So let's get into it. Let's get into the topic of today. Oscar Wilde is quoted as saying, "The answers are all out there. We just need to ask the right questions." Let's talk about that. Let's talk about if the answers are out there, and I believe that they are. How do we as leaders, as team members, as colleagues, how do we ask the right questions? When we look at the benefit of a good question at a very baseline, in its most simplistic way, a good question is an exchange of information. You have information that I need, or I have information that you need. And through asking a question, we're able to exchange that information. While that is important, it's only the very tip of the iceberg of what good questions can do. A few years ago, researchers at the Harvard Business School did a multi-year effort to look at how can we ask more effective questions in the workplace. And what they found at the end of their study was that really good questions can do all of the things that you're looking at on the screen. So yes, of course, there's going to be an exchange of information, but we can also unlock value that would remain untapped otherwise. We can spur learning. We can ignite innovation. If we ask questions in the right way, we can fuel performance. And the one that I love, the second to last one, is that when done really well, we can ask questions that build trust. Trust is the foundation of everything that we do. It doesn't matter how talented your team is. If the team doesn't trust each other, they are never going to reach their full potential. Are we asking questions that build trust? Or are we asking questions that leave people feeling afraid or unsafe or unsure? When we ask really good questions, we not only help ourselves and our teams, we can help the entire organization. We can mitigate risk, we can mitigate pitfalls, we can acknowledge blind spots, and all of that can be done through good questions. I think there's one other thing that can come from really good questions. And what I would add is that really good questions drive connection. In her book, Dare to Lead, Brene Brown defines connection as the energy that exists between people when we feel seen, heard, and valued, and when we can give and receive without judgment. I believe that really good questions drive connection. They drive connection in that it's okay to share what the truth is because we're not worried about judgment. It's okay to be able to ask those questions because we know we're going to be met by someone who sees and hears and values our answer. Many times when we talk about how to ask good questions, we jump right into the asking questions part. Here's what makes a good question. Here's what makes a bad question. Here's when to do it. Here's why. Here's how. I believe that the real work happens long before we ever ask the question. And so we're going to approach today as looking at 3 chunks. We're going to look at what do we do? What can we do before we ever even ask a question to help us be more successful? Then we're going to talk about, okay, now we're in the conversation. What can we do to ask really meaningful questions? And then we're going to end with what happens after. Asking really good questions doesn't end once the question's been asked. In fact, some would say that's just the start of it. And so what is it that we do after that's going to leave an impact in our organization? So let's look at part 1. Let's look at what can we do as leaders and colleagues to ask more meaningful questions. In the research study I told you about a few minutes ago, that multi-year effort by Harvard Business School, the author said, most of us don't ask enough questions, nor do we pose our inquiries in an optimal way. I think that is a very lovely diplomatic way of saying what I read between the lines. And what I read between the lines is most of us don't ask enough questions. And when we do, we can ask pretty crappy ones. So again, that's my interpretation. Pretty crappy ones didn't come from the researchers, but that's what I'm reading between the lines. That many times we go through our day and we can ask some pretty crappy questions. We can also be on the receiving end of that. My guess is that you've been asked a pretty crappy question at work. At some point in your work life, you have been asked a pretty crappy question. And how would you know? Well, what's the difference? How do I know if it's a good question? A not so good question is not a real question at all. It's a statement disguised as a question. If I were to ask you a leading question and I were to say something like, I really think that we should move ahead with this 30-day policy change. Don't you agree? That's leading you. That's saying, I've already got the solution in mind. I think it's a 30-day policy change. And don't you already agree? Versus allowing someone to think about what might the better solution be. Same way with assumptive and binary. We box people in. With binary questions, we give people two options rather than considering, are there more than two? We also ask a whole lot of confusing questions. I am a certified mediator. I spend a lot of my time mediating conflict and helping teams have tough conversations. And a large part of my work is just helping people untangle confusing questions. That it might sound in our head like it makes sense, but the other person has no idea at all what we're talking about. How can we be as clear as possible? A little bit later today, we're going to talk about some methodologies that can help, especially now as stress levels can be higher and higher in organizations. Our need to be clearer is more than ever before. And the last one on double barreled is when we're almost overwhelming. We're asking two questions at one time. And now the individual has to try to figure out which of these questions am I supposed to answer and are they connected? And I don't know. We create a cognitive load rather than allowing someone to have time and space to think through the answer. I have a question for you, which of course I do, because this is a workshop on questions. And I'm wondering, why might we hold back from asking a question at work? So if it's true that some of us don't ask as many questions as we could through the day, go ahead and type in the chat feature, why might that be? All right, look at, oh my gosh, you are question experts. So I'm seeing anxiety, fear of retaliation. There's not enough trust. Thank you for that. Cindy, yep, absolutely. I worry about fear and judgment. Thank you. I've been told not to. Wow. Thank you for that. That absolutely. If we are told either directly or indirectly that this is not a place to ask questions, then that's absolutely going to hold you back. It might look like I'm not knowledgeable enough. Yeah, thank you, Linda. That is such an insightful way to say it, that sometimes we don't ask questions for that very reason. Thank you. Therese says it could be based on a negative experience. Yeah, we tried it. It didn't work out so well. So why would we do it again? Worrying about asking a stupid question. Thank you for that. I'm worried about trust. I'm afraid of how people see me. Not a safe place from Carrie. Thank you. I want to build on what we just heard from Linda and Carrie and others of you who talked about it doesn't feel safe to do it. I'm worried about retaliation. It is what we need to build in organizations in order to have meaningful questions that get asked. In order to feel safe enough to ask a meaningful question, there has to be psychological safety on the team. Dr. Amy Edmondson, a professor at Harvard, coined the term psychological safety in the late 90s, and she defines it this way. She defines it as a shared belief by members of a team that the team is safe for risk-taking. And that means that I can share my ideas, I can share my thoughts, I can ask questions without the fear of judgment, without the fear of retaliation. That is psychological safety. If you are in a team where there's low trust, there's low psychological safety, and you tell them to ask more questions, you're asking them to do something really hard, if not impossible. It is hard to ask meaningful questions if we don't believe that the team is a safe place to do that. Dr. Edmondson talks that she mentions in her book, Fearless Organizations, and also in her TED Talk, if you have 11 minutes and you're thinking, how am I going to spend the next 11 minutes of my life? I would encourage you to watch Dr. Amy Edmondson's TED Talk on psychological safety. It is so good. It's only 11 minutes, but it's so good. And what she tells us is that when we get up in the morning, when we show up at work or when we hop on Zoom, none of us want to look ignorant or incompetent. None of us say, gosh, I've got this new job and I really hope that I get to be the intrusive one. Or today's my first day getting to meet this new team. I really hope they see me as negative. I really hope they see me as, we would never do that. We would never think that. And so the good news from Dr. Edmondson is that we can manage it. We can manage those things actually relatively easily. If we don't want to look ignorant, if we don't want to look like we don't know, then we just don't ask questions. We think, well, I'll figure it out. Or if everybody else knows, I should certainly know. And if we don't want to look incompetent, then we don't talk about our weaknesses. We don't open up about our mistakes. We don't talk about where things have gone better or how things could have gone differently. If we don't want to be intrusive, then we don't offer our own ideas. We encourage others' ideas, we're in support of others' ideas, but we're not going to offer our own. And if we don't want to be negative, then we're not going to critique the status quo. Those of you who care about building diverse, equitable, inclusive, belonging workplaces as much as I do, I know that you do, this is a huge piece of that. If what we really want is to create a space where we can talk about the status quo, where we can say there are systemic issues here that need to be changed, we've got to create the psychological safety in order for that to happen. It's the only way that those questions are going to be able to come into the conversation. The process of managing it, if I don't want to be this, then I'm not going to do this. It's called impression management. And Dr. Edmondson writes that we know how to do this really early on. And in fact, by the time we enter grade school, it's almost second nature. So think about how long we've been practicing this by the time we get into an organization. So much of asking good questions is not just learning something new, it's unlearning what's not serving us. What do we have to unlearn about questions? Do we have to unlearn that I ask a question so it makes me look smart? Do I have to unlearn that whoever asks the most questions clearly doesn't have a clue what's going on here? What do we have to unlearn about questions? In the 1960s was the first time that research came out around the role that impression management plays in conversation. And at the time, the researchers called that liking. That if we were to look at the goal of conversations, that there were two primary goals, according to the researchers. The first one was impression management. The second one was information exchange. So this idea that we are learning together, but while doing that, we're under this umbrella of impression management. Later in her work, Dr. Amy Edmondson found that the same thing happens when we're creating psychological safety. And the research team that I mentioned a few years ago at Harvard found that these same two constructs were there in the majority of questions. Who cares? Why does that matter? It matters because how we structure those questions within the conversations is going to greatly impact what we get back. I am a leadership coach. I coach leaders often on how are you asking questions? What are you trying to achieve through those questions? And very often, one of the goals of their questions is accountability. They want to figure out where is this project or what's the status there. So often the questions can be around accountability. So let's look at that. Let's look at how can we ask better questions if that is our goal. When we look at the nexus between psychological safety on a team, and again, just a quick reminder, that means, is this a safe place for me to take a risk? Can I share a thought, an opinion, an idea without the fear of being judged, without the fear of retaliation? So that's on your left axis. And then on your right one, you've got, what is the motivation? What is the accountability that an individual is feeling, that an individual is under in an organization? When we have really high levels of psychological safety, but really low levels of accountability, Dr. Edmondson would call that the comfort zone. And so there could be all kinds of questions that you ask in the comfort zone because it's really not about accountability in that place. And in fact, if you think about the comfort zone, you might be able to ride that wave for weeks or months or years. If you're not being held accountable, maybe you could be in that job forever if you wanted. If we look at when we are being, when there's little of both, so I don't feel psychologically safe on this team, I'm not being held accountable, then that's apathy. And you will see in that zone that people start to get really burnt out. People can start to feel resentful. People can feel bitter. It's not a good place to be. Apathy is not a place that drives innovation. It doesn't drive creativity. It doesn't drive us to be the best version of who we can be. The third is if we have low levels of safety, low levels of psychological safety, but a high degree of accountability, that actually results in anxiety. And I would challenge you to think about the last conversation, think about the last few conversations you've had. Have you asked questions that really drive someone to an anxiety zone? Are you asking questions in a way that raises others' anxiety? Are you asking questions in a way that is demanding accountability, but we haven't put the work in to create a safe space? The last one, and this is where we want to be, this is where Dr. Edmondson wants us to be, this is where we're all going to want to be, is what she calls the learning zone. And the learning zone only happens when there is a high degree of safety and there's also a high degree of accountability. When that happens, when we're in the learning zone, then the questions that we're asking are about the pursuit of improvement. It's not about, are we going to tear someone down, or is this person going to feel shame, or are we blaming that division instead of this division? None of that happens in the learning zone. The learning zone is truly, what is it that we can learn? It's not an execution problem, to use Dr. Edmondson's terms. It's not an execution problem. It's a learning problem. What can we learn? In order to be in the learning zone, you'll notice that there has to be psychological safety. If I'm on a team and I am terrified to make a mistake, or if I heard a story of the last time someone asked a question, they were fired and let go, that's not a learning zone. All of this work happens before you're ever even asking a question. The time to build psychological safety, the time to build trust, the time to build relationship is long before you're ever in a spot where you need to ask tough questions. So let's look at what happens during. So let's assume that we have laid the groundwork, or at least we're working to do it, because sometimes we don't get the luxury. Sometimes we got to ask tough questions and we don't get any lead time. So then it becomes, how do I do this quickly? How do I build trust in a way that makes it clear what my intent is in asking these questions? So let's shift to during. So now we're in this conversation. We're in a tough conversation. I believe that the path forward is curiosity. In those conversations, when you're asking questions, are you genuinely curious? And not fake curiosity. My guess is you've been on the other end of fake curiosity. That's not helpful. That doesn't drive connection. That actually drives disconnection. We're talking about genuine, authentic curiosity. In the book, Dare to Lead, Brene gives us some ideas, some rumble starters, as she calls them. And I put these on page 2 in your handout, so you'd have them as a resource. The idea is, can we ask questions? Can we create conversations where there is more listening on our side and not just talking? So let's look at some of these. You'll notice that the very way that they're structured means that we're going to be listening. If I say to you, gosh, help me understand what happened with that project. When we were together last week, it seemed like we were on time. It looked like we were going to deliver by the end of Friday, and we missed that. Help me understand. Now I've actually created this space where I am going to be able to sit back and hear what was true, rather than jumping to conclusions, rather than jumping to assumptions. If we're genuinely curious, if we've created those spaces, it will put us in the learning zone. We as leaders, as colleagues, as team members, we want to approach it from the place of a learner. We don't have to know it all. We're never going to know it all, but are we open to learning? Are we open to the fact that during this answer, I may learn something that I didn't know before? I may learn that I am either directly or indirectly contributing to what's happening, and I didn't even realize that before. When we look at this connection between accountability and psychological safety and asking good questions, one thing I would caution you against is blame. Blame. Many times we can use questions as a disguise for blame. Rather than really being curious, rather than truly trying to understand, we ask a question that's actually blaming the other person. And when we're confronted with blame, we will put up a defense, we're going to put up a shield. We're not going to be able to engage and respond in a way that's going to move the organization forward. I've got a really short video. It's just over 2 minutes. And it's of Brene. It's a fun cartoon where she's going to talk to us about blame. What is blame? And why do we have to understand it if we're going to ask really good questions? All right, here's Brene.
How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I am a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And the first, a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back like at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of that story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, This is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the na thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
If you are preparing to ask a question, it's worth considering, why am I asking this? Am I trying to figure out whose fault it is? And if that's what you're trying to do, if you're trying to figure out whose fault it is, really all you're looking for is someone to blame. That's not going to be a genuine question. And we heard in the video from Brene that blame has an inverse relationship to accountability. It's actually going to make it harder for you to hold individuals accountable. So how do we back away from that? How do we back away from shame? We lose that desire for blame, and it really becomes around staying in the learning zone. There is no place for blame in the learning zone. Blame will take us out of the learning zone. The learning zone, really high accountability. Let's talk about it. It's such a good lean principle. Let's reassess. Let's figure out where we are. Let's move forward. We're always innovating and recreating. There's no place for blame in that process. Once we've asked the question, once we've put it out there, then we've really got to make sure that we're listening to the answer. If you've ever been on the receiving end of someone who asks you a question and it's clear that they're not listening to the answer, that doesn't leave us feeling seen, heard, or valued. That doesn't leave you wanting to share what's really happening. In organizations where we're not listening, where not listening has become the norm, we're at a higher risk of things. We're at a higher risk for liability, because now we're not raising concerns. We're not raising what those issues might be. I believe that most of us want to be good listeners. I believe the very vast majority of us want to be really good listeners. And yet sometimes we're really not. And so what do you think is the impact that stress has on our ability to listen? What do you think? Type it in the chat feature. Do you think that stress impacts our ability to really, truly listen to an answer? Yeah, oh, good. I'm seeing yes in all caps. I love that. Totally, yes. 100% yes. You are all neuroscientists, because here's what we know from neuroscience. We know that all day long, there's a fundamental organizing principle of the brain. And it is telling us all day, is this a potential threat that I need to move away from? Is this a potential reward that I need to move toward? In times of extreme stress, when we're over in that threat response, we know, based on decades of research, that our cognitive capacity goes down. We can't listen as clearly. We don't retain information as well. It's why sometimes you may walk out of a meeting with a coworker and you start sharing notes and you think, were we in the same spot? That's not at all what I heard. In times of stress, we've got to be even more mindful about how we ask questions. I wanted to share a methodology for you, and I put this in your worksheet so that you would have it. It's a really simple construct, but it's an incredibly powerful construct. This comes from David Rock. He is a neuroscientist who founded the Neuro Leadership Institute. And when David Rock talks about how we ask questions, how we share information, he encourages us to use the FACT model. that when we use the FACT model, we are leveraging how we think. We're leveraging the latest neuroscience. And here's what he would say. When we look at the efforts around fluency, how easy or hard are we making it? Do you have a colleague that sends you an email and it takes up 13 of your computer screens? Or if you're reading the email on your phone, you're just scrolling because the emails are so long and maybe there's sub bullets and highlights. And Dr. Rock would say that's not fluency, that we have to make it as easy as possible for others to process information, make it as easy as possible for people to understand what is the question that you're asking. The A is how much information can we really hold? There's a reason why social security numbers are broken up the way that they are. There's a reason why phone numbers are broken up the way they are. There's a reason why most marketing campaigns are broken up the way that they are, because there's only so much that we can hold at one time in our brain. Are we asking questions that honors that? Or are we overloading people at a time when they're already feeling overwhelmed? The C is on coherence. And I spend a lot of my time helping leaders with the coherence part, which is how does what I'm asking you, how is what we're talking about, how does that connect to what we already know? Are you catching people off guard? Does it seem like you're coming in from left field? Or are your questions connected to what's already happening? Are we making it as easy as possible for people to connect the dots between what you're asking for and what you've asked for before? Or what you're asking for now, how is it different than what you asked for before? And then the last one, we can often overlook it, but I don't think we can afford to. Time is how much time does it take for us to process? And we may all have different processing speeds. We may have different processing speeds as we move through the week. As our stress levels get higher, our processing time can change. Are we asking questions in a way that honors that processing time? Are we providing lead time? Are we saying, think about it and get back to me tomorrow? Are we using these very basic structures of neuroscience to make sure that the information we get back from our questions is as good as it can be? And then the very last part is, okay, you've asked the question, now what? So you're done, you celebrate yourself and you send me an email so I can cheer you on too. We're not quite done yet. The third piece is we've got to follow up. We've got to close the loop. I spent just over 20 years in state government. I loved working for Washington state government. And one of the things that in all the agencies I was a part of, one of the things we were always working on is how do we do a better job of closing the loop? We would get feedback on something and we would change a process or we would change something based on that feedback. But we were so busy moving on to the next thing that we didn't always close the loop. We didn't always circle back and say, you said X and we did Y. Are we closing the loop after we've asked a question so that it's clear what we did with that information? When we look at how do we get better at this, what the researchers at Harvard would say is that you've got to look at not just the quality of your questions, they also said to look at the quantity. And here's what they meant by that. They said to think about your baseline right now. Think about the last week at work. How many questions did you ask? And then be deliberate about increasing the amount of questions as you move forward. And of course, not nonsensical questions, but actually really good questions that matter. And the reason why they suggest that is they found that through deliberate practice, when we ask questions, we naturally improve our emotional intelligence. And the more emotionally intelligent we are, the better question askers, I'm not sure if that's a word, but I like it. Questioners is probably the word. The better questioners we become. So to wrap it all up, I wanted to say that what would happen to your team? What would happen in your organization if you were to end fewer sentences with a period and more sentences with a question mark? What might happen if you opened up your heart and your mind to how someone would answer that question? I am thrilled that we have a graphic recorder in this workshop with us. So if you want to get a copy of that, I'll put up the address for you in the chat feature. And Jessica, I would love to hear, what are some of the questions that you've gotten? I can't wait. Isn't it kind of funny to answer questions in a workshop on questions?
Great. Thank you, Amy. Oh, let me just make sure I'm spotlighted here. Okay, so we've got a few questions. So Amy, when you talk about a safe environment to ask questions, does this apply staff to staff, staff to leadership, or leader to leader, or all of those situations?
Great question. I think it's all of it. And Dr. Edmondson would say the same thing, that psychologically safe workspaces are wherever we are. So meaning that whether I am talking to a colleague or whether I'm talking to my boss or whether I'm talking to my direct report, do I feel safe to share my thoughts and my ideas without the fear of being judged, without the fear of there being some kind of retaliation for what I say? I think it can be easier and harder to build psychological safety depending on the group we're talking about. So for example, you may find it really easy to build that with your colleagues, and maybe it's a little harder to build it in other places. But I think it applies to all of those. It's a really good question.
Okay. Got quite a few good questions in here. Do you have any advice for developing quality follow-up questions? Sometimes it can take time to realize that you missed an important question that you should have asked earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we need to put as much thought and care into the follow-up questions as we did to the initial ones. And I always come back to intent. So I always come back to why. Why am I asking this question? Why am I following up? And if you're following up because you went to a workshop and you were told you had to follow up, don't start there, right? Let's unpack until we get an even better sense of what our intent is. When we follow up, it's a huge opportunity to build trust. Every time we have an exchange with each other, I am either showing you that I am a trustworthy individual or that I'm not a trustworthy individual. Following up, when we don't follow up, we miss a huge opportunity to build trust. We miss a huge opportunity for connection. And so I would say to that questioner to really start with, what is your intent? What is your intent in the follow-up? And then how can that question get you closer? I like, when I do mediations, for example, I always do a 60-day follow-up. And before I end, I will say, when I follow up, what do you think is going to be something that we'd want to talk about? What's on your mind right now? And then we at least have a place to start. It's a way to connect. Here's what we did before, and here's where we are now.
Okay, great. We've got someone wondering if you have any tips on having the courage to say, I don't know, but let me find out and get back to you when you're asked a question you don't know the answer to.
I'm not sure if you can see my body language in Zoom, but did you see my reaction when Jessica asked that? Like, I had to literally take a deep breath. Yeah, I think the only way to do it is through practice. We have to be willing to accept the vulnerability in that. The definition of vulnerability is there's uncertainty, there's risk, and there's emotional exposure. There is vulnerability in saying, I don't know. It's also a huge opportunity to build trust. 100% of the time, I would rather have someone say to me, I don't know the answer, than try to BS me through something. That doesn't build trust, that doesn't build connection, it doesn't build credibility. It also does something that I think is incredibly powerful, which is that it models it's okay to learn. If we're going to be in that learning zone that we talked about from Dr. Edmondson, in that zone is a place of learning. And learning by definition is, I don't know everything. So it does an incredible, incredible service, I believe, in modeling that it's okay not to know all the answers. I would also caution that once we think we know all the answers, that we might be overly confident. Because I can't think of a single job where a single person knows all the answers. If you talk to the best leaders, the best athletes, the best coaches, they all talk with each other. They all have other resources because there's no one way to know everything.
Thank you. Do you have any tips or skills for asking questions in a virtual environment when you can't see your team? How do you
Amen.
measure safety within the team without having that cue of body language?
Yeah, thank you. Here's my tip, and I'm using it with all of my coaching clients, is I believe that we need to start asking people how they want to engage. I believe we need to start asking people how they want to engage. I am a self-prescribed introvert, so I will just name that. When I get 13 Zoom calls a day, I want to cry, right? I mean, you get to the 13th one and you're like, I just can't do this anymore. And yet in this virtual world, we have so quickly defaulted to video. And there are wonderful benefits to video. There are absolute benefits backed up by neuroscience of when we should be in a video engagement. There are also times where that could hold us back. So when I'm coaching a leader, if they've got to have a tough feedback conversation, I encourage them to ask the team member, how do you want to engage? What's best for you? Do you want to hop on a phone call? Do you want to hop on a video call? Let the other person have some autonomy over what that exchange looks like. The other thing, let's say that they've agreed, yeah, I do want to be virtual. I do want to be video. So now you're face to face. When we ask questions virtually, we have to allow more pause time. We have to allow more pause time. If you've ever been in one of those awkward Zoom calls where every time you talk, they talk, and then you talk and they talk, it's just this kind of catch game. We want to be really, really mindful in a virtual space that we're pausing more. And for many of us, silence can feel uncomfortable. Many of us might be, silence fillers, that if it's silent for too long, we just start jumping in. That's another example of what we have to unlearn. We have to unlearn that silence is okay, and in a virtual environment, be willing to pause. Even if you're starting to feel uncomfortable, make sure the pause is long enough so that the other person can engage virtually. That's off the top of my head, Jessica. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. It's very impressive for off the top of your head. So we have a couple of questions along the line of how can you help a team or individual who is shy to share? How do you foster an environment, psychological safety for those who are shy?
Great question. So there are good tips from neuroscience. There are things about creating level playing fields. So for example, if you are in a hybrid meeting where you've got some individuals who are virtual and some who are in the room, some who may be more shy than others, are you creating that level playing field? Are you inviting them to speak in first? Are you giving people an opportunity to think ahead? Many times we believe that someone is shy when in fact they just have a longer processing time. It's not that I'm shy, it's that I would have just really liked 5 minutes to think about what you were asking me. So are we building in lead time to let people engage the way that they want to? I would also go back to, can we let people have autonomy over how they participate? If there's someone on your team and you haven't heard from them as much, rather than just going to Neuroscience 101, what if I were to say, Jessica, I love having you on this team, and it's really important to me that the rest of the team get to hear your ideas. How can I make that easier for you? What would that look like? And most of the time, they'll have an answer. They'll tell you what it is they need, or maybe they'll say, whatever you do, don't do this thing. Whatever you do, don't call on me, or whatever. But you start to create some shared agreements around, here's what that's going to look like. I think we also fall into the trap that we sometimes equate participation with talking. And I will tell you as a trainer that there are times when the quietest person in the room is the one working the hardest, because they are reflecting, they're thinking, they're connecting the dots, they're trying to process, how am I going to apply this when I get back at work? So we can't fall into that trap that participation just looks like someone speaking. We've got to have a shared agreement around, what does participation look like?
Great. I think we probably have time for one more question. Do you have any tried and true go-to questions to help people shift their thinking?
Yes. Oh my gosh. And here's the thing about questions. the best questions that we can ask other people are the best questions we can ask ourselves. And so when we use questions to help someone shift their thinking, when we say things like, what happens if nothing changes? What would it be like if this went the way you wanted it to? Or if nothing changes, how is this holding you back? When we ask those types of mind shifting questions, we have to remember that we need to be the recipient of those too. I coach some leaders who ask really kind, considerate questions to have people think about a mindset shift. And yet the questions they ask of themselves are full of judgment and blame and shame. So the same way that we use that thoughtful approach with other people to shift a mindset, I believe is the exact same thing that we need to direct it ourselves to. Easier said than done, but it's exactly the right thing to do for ourselves.
Okay, well, I think I fibbed when I said we had time for one more question. We might have time for one more.
This all day. I could just stay here for hours.
Do you have any advice on some ways to fight listening fatigue? So, you're listening actively all day at work and then you go home, or, you switch gears and your family is also expecting that of you. Any ideas on that?
Absolutely. And I think this is where we have to be honest about our own abilities and our own capacity. I was reading an article when I was getting prepared for this presentation, and it said that kids between the age of 2 and 5 ask 40,000 questions. 40,000. And at first that seemed hard to believe. And then I thought about, well, no, I've raised 2 to 5 year olds and I think they do ask 40,000 questions. So I think the first part is self-awareness. Self-awareness of, am I being my best self? And not overscheduling, not overbooking, because it's not fair to the other person. If you don't have the time to listen to the answer, then don't ask the question. I truly believe that. And I tell every leader I coach that if you do not have the time to listen to the answer, then don't ask the question. And I believe the way that we create the time and space is really through knowing ourselves. Is it better for you to have really tough conversations at the beginning of the day versus the end of the day? Are you better virtually versus not? I mean, you start to know yourself and track your energy through the day so that you're directing it in the way that's going to be the most helpful. We have a code in our house. If you ever run into any of the Lennikers, we call it a 4-corner night. So there are 4 of us. And what it means is that at any point, any Lenniker can say 4 corners. And what that means is that for this next period of time, we leave each other alone. So I started this 4-corner as an introvert who trains and coaches all day long, that there are times when I get to the end of the day and I just need 30 minutes to catch my breath. What has been incredible to see is how our teenager and our 11-year-old now do the same thing. It's really their way of setting their own boundary. It's not saying I'm never going to engage. It's saying I just need a few minutes. And I think if we could allow that same thing in organizations, that same boundary that says, Jessica, I am really interested in what you have to say. I just need a couple of minutes, or I would love to connect with you tomorrow. I believe those healthy boundaries are what would allow us to do that.
Great. Well, thank you, Amy, so much. We are at time today. Thanks everybody for being here. There's more of the conference to come. Visit our website for more information. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.